All right. My name is John Zweber. I'm a Dakota County Master Gardener and a certified square foot gardening instructor, as well as a small business owner of Easy Gardens by John. Now, does this look familiar? I know as the season progresses, many of our gardens start to look like this. And hopefully today, after learning the fundamentals of square foot gardening, that you can change all of this. So this is what we will cover today. We'll cover what square foot gardening is, the basics of square foot gardening, improvements to square foot gardening, and we'll cover briefly on vertical gardening as well as extending the gardening season. So a short history of the square foot gardening. It was started back in 1976 by Mayor Bartholomew. He was a civil engineer who one of the summers he joined a community garden, and he realized at the beginning of the season, there were usually a huge crowd, and as the season progressed, the number of gardeners that showed up slowly diminished. And he tried to figure out exactly what was going on. And one of the biggest problems was people were spending more time weeding and maintaining the garden versus actually gardening. So he came up with square foot gardening, where he removed part of the existing soil and added in vermiculite and peat moss. And originally, it didn't have any grids present. And he wanted to make the gardening as simple and fun and enjoyable as possible. And so that's how he came up with square foot gardening. Basically, square foot gardening is just a simple, productive gardening system. There are numerous gardening systems out there, and square foot gardening happens to be one of them. May not be the best for everyone, but it is something simple, easy to do, and many people that do practice square foot gardening find it very enjoyable. So the biggest part of square foot gardening is that it saves you time, money, water, and work. And that's the whole objective, is that we spend so much time weeding and trying to keep everything else but the garden looking good, that many people, as the season progresses, you just get tired of it and sick of spending the time and effort. So many people give up. And hopefully after listening to this talk that you will find a new joy for gardening. So compared to conventional single row gardening, typically you can enjoy 100% of your harvest, use 20% of your space. For example, a typical 10-foot by 10-foot garden on the ground, for a square foot garden, you only need a space approximately 4-foot by 4-foot garden. Minimize watering, reduce it by about 10%. You probably only use fraction of the seeds that you normally would use, and probably a fraction of the work. And initially, there was almost no weeding involved. Some benefits, anyone can do it. This is my daughter when she used to be a little angel, and now she's 19 and not quite the same, but she's still lovable. You're using 20% of the space, and you're using all your space efficiently. You don't have any wasted space in your garden, and less work and less resources. Just with any gardening, you have to have specific criteria, and the biggest part is selecting your site. Number one, most people have their gardens typically when they look at your house, they typically find a place in the corner of the house that's typically out of sight. And one of the things with square foot gardening I try to tell people is try to have the garden close to the house so that you actually see the garden every day. One thing we can't control is that you need to have minimum of 6 hours of sunlight. The more, the better, because if it's less than 6, it limits the things that you can grow. And if it gets sunlight all day, you can always do things to minimize the impact of the sun, but it should get minimum of 6 hours of sunlight. You want to stay away from trees and shrubs because those will compete with your vegetables for nutrients. And when I say stay away from trees, especially overgrown big trees that's been around for a while, you want to stay away from the canopy, meaning the edge of your branch of the leaves of the tree. So stay away from those. And you want a relatively flat surface. Many people, they start a new garden, and come May, when all the rain comes, that they are flooded in, their gardening plot is flooded, or they can't even get into the garden until June when everything dries up. And this happened about 3-4 years ago when we had a lot of snow in the wintertime, and when all that snow melted, people couldn't even get to the garden because it was in a low area of their yard. And the existing soil, that's not a concern because you aren't going to use any of that soil. So many places, you may have clay soils, or you may have really sandy soil. For us, where I live in Rosemount, we have the topsoil is really good, but it is very sandy. And after a heavy rainfall, within an hour or so, all that water has just soaked right into the ground. But with square foot gardening, it doesn't matter what type of soil you have. So these are the 10 basic things we'll cover step by step through each one of these. So first thing is to start thinking in squares and not in rows. So square foot gardening, just what the name says, is we are dealing with individual squares. So every square foot is like a separate garden. So you start with a box. So the box itself can be constructed any size that you want, and we'll go over the dimensions that best suits the square foot gardening. So constructing the box, things you can use, any type of lumber. I try to stay away from any treated lumber. Cedar works well. Redwood, it's a bit expensive, but it'll be much longer lasting. You can use cement blocks, untreated lumber, 1x6 or 2x6, anything, any lumber basically will work, or any even cement blocks and whatnot. Biggest thing is you want to make it only about 4 feet wide if you're building that garden for an adult. Now, if you have, and that's if you have access on all sides. If you only have access on one side, you only want to make it about 2 feet wide so that you don't walk on that garden. Now, if you're making a garden for a child and you have access on both sides, try to make it about 3 feet wide for your child. Now, if it's on the ground, basically all you need is weed block. And if it's all off the ground, like or in a cement deck or whatnot, you can use a plywood bottom for the bottom if it's off the ground. Constructing the box, this is simple. However wide, length, or long you want to make that box, typically I don't make it any longer than like 12 feet, just because you don't want to be walking around the garden. So if you make it 20 feet long, that means if you want to get to the other side, you have to be walking 20 feet across to make it to the other side. So I try to make it about 8 to 12 feet at the longest. So you want to cut your lumber to whatever length that you want. Then you want to be secure the corners, and as you can see on the lower picture, you want to make sure you overlap into a circular manner on the corners so that it's not a square, because if you have the ends even, meaning the both boards going parallel to each other, and it's not offset on the corners, then it's not going to be perfectly square. That doesn't make much of a difference if you have it on the ground, but if you have it off the ground with legs, then you'll notice a difference when you try to make the bottom. It makes a slight difference. And you want to pre-drill those holes before you secure it with screws. So like I said, if it's going to be on the ground, you can just put landscape fabric, and later on we'll show you how everything looks when you have it installed on the ground. So to add some stability, whether it's on the ground or on legs, you can add some corner pieces. I usually add some pieces on the corners on the sides to make it more secure. And as far as what you can grow in it, you can grow pretty much anything, just like you can grow on the ground. So this garden is a few years old, And it's a 3 foot by 3 foot garden. As you can see, the different things I have, and this was started in March. So this is about 2 weeks into it. This was on my deck in around March, end of March, beginning of April, and I did have heat in a mini greenhouse that was there. So you can see lettuce, spinach, radishes, and this is about a month later. So the radishes are in the middle, spinach and lettuce on the sides. Next, we'll cover the aisles. You want to make sure the aisles are nice and comfortable, that you can walk between that. If you need to use a wheelbarrow, you want to have plenty of space. So minimum, I try to make it about 3 feet if you have the space. And then you can place mulch, you can leave it as grass or whatever is comfortable for you. So this is a nice garden here. This is a friend of mine. They got sick of weeding every spring, so they converted their whole garden to square foot garden. So this is 6 4x8 square foot gardens. You see how nice space there is in between the gardens. Plenty of space to push a wheelbarrow around, and covered with mulch. So very minimal weeding involved. The next thing that we'll cover is maize mix, which is probably the biggest thing for your square foot garden. So and this is why you don't need any soil for the garden. So it doesn't matter what type of soil you have, because you're going to start off with something that is completely soilless. So the 3 parts are peat moss, vermiculite, and compost. Now, peat moss helps provide retain moisture. The vermiculite also retains moisture as well and keeps it from getting hard and permits air through the soil mix. And then the compost is what provides the nutrients for your plants. So the 3 components, when you're mixing it, you're going to be using a 1/3 part peat moss, a 1/3 part vermiculite, and a 1/3 part well-blended compost. And when we talk about well-blended compost, meaning that if you are buying bags of compost at your local garden store or wherever, you want to try and get 1 bag of each variety. There are multiple varieties of compost out there. I mean, cow manure, horse manure, there is bat guano, there is worm castings and whatnot. So you want to get a good variety of compost and then mix all of that together. And this is all by volume. So we'll show you how you make that. Oh, sorry, hang on. So what you want to do is you want to combine the 3 ingredients together. So what I usually use is a 5-gallon bucket. So I get 1 5-gallon bucket of vermiculite, 1 5-gallon bucket of peat moss, and 1 5-gallon bucket of compost. And then I dump it all into a wheelbarrow, right here into a wheelbarrow. And then you just mix it in until everything looks thoroughly mixed. And then you just pour it into your garden, whatever size garden that you have. Next is the grids. So the grids outlines your squares for your square foot garden. It can be made from pretty much anything. Wooden lathing works well, vertical blinds. If worse comes to worse, or if you're in a hurry, you can use string, you can use electrical tape, duct tape, but you want something that's going to be pretty permanent for the season, and you want it to stand out. So you don't want to just make it really hastily, but you do want to make sure that it's definitely noticeable. So the grid here, so this is what it looks like with the grid. And as a square foot garden without a grid isn't a square foot garden. This is a traditional garden on the left here. So you have a 4 foot by 8 foot garden there without the grids. And when you add the grids, it makes it completely different. So you see on the right with the grids added, and that's your square foot garden. Next, we'll talk about caring for the garden quickly. So you want to water your garden individually. You don't need to worry about fertilizing because the compost that the well-blended compost that you have provides the nutrients for your vegetables. Very minimal weeding. Initially, when you start out the first season, typically you have 0 weeds. Every once in a while, depending on the compost, you may get some weed seeds in it, but very rarely. Now, as far as tools for planting your square foot garden, it's very, very minimal. You no longer need shovels and tillers and whatnot for gardening. All you need are three simple things: a pencil, which you'll use to poke holes to plant your seeds; a trowel for mixing up digging bigger holes for transplants, mixing up more compost; and a pair of scissors for your thinning and harvesting your vegetables. This is it. This is once it's established, these are really the only tools that you need. Now, thinning your garden. So when you plant your square foot garden, which we'll cover shortly, you'll be planting 2 to 3 seeds, and you use your scissors to thin your plants that have grown. So when you plant 2 to 3 seeds, you want to keep the strongest plant, and instead of tearing that plant out by the roots, you cut it right below the soil level, as you can see in the image right here, right below the soil level with the seeds. This way, it doesn't disturb the other plants. Now, plant selection, just like any gardens, you can grow pretty much anything in it. You can grow in most flowers and vegetables. I've grown multiple types of different things like peanuts, sweet potatoes. I've grown carrots and tomatoes, and you name it, you can grow pretty much anything about it. The nice thing about it is because of the variety of plants that you're growing in your garden, it promotes less disease versus having one type of vegetable or one type of plant in that whole garden. Also, you practice somewhat of companion planting with different herbs and vegetables, and so it continuously, you have a less tendency for diseases and problems. Now, plant selection, it's like I said, pretty much anything. These are snow peas. Anything that grows or climbs, has a tendency to climb, you want to use trellises, so you are growing things up. And we'll cover a little bit more about vertical gardening at the end. Brussels sprouts, this is takes up 1 square foot, and you can have Brussels sprouts. Cucumbers, same thing with cucumbers. They have a tendency, they climb, so I always put it up on a trellis. Potatoes, in each square, you can usually get, out of 1 square, you can usually get probably about 8 to 10 potatoes in 1 square. The picture on the right here, that's a 2 foot by 4 foot garden that's on a deck with on legs, and they have tomatoes on one side. These are strawberries, and then I think these were some flowers that he wanted to plant. So planting the square foot garden, this is probably the next most important thing, because you need to decide on how to plant it. You don't just plant everything like in a row, like on the ground when you're typically planting a row of seeds. You don't need as many seeds because you're using only very minimal number of seeds. But you do have to decide on the layout of your garden. So you don't want to just throw everything in there and see how everything grows. So larger plants, things that climb, like your cucumbers, your tomatoes, you want to plant those on the north side of your garden so that when they get bigger, they don't shade everything else. And to plant it, so the biggest thing is the size determines how many plants or seeds that you are going to plant in each square. And you want to read the labels on each seed packet, and there's one section of the seed packet that you want to pay attention to, and that is what it says here, thin to instruction. And all of your seed packets will tell you what distance to thin your plants to, and then or what it also says is what the finer spacing is. So typically in each square, you're either going to plant 1 plant, 4 plants, 9 plants, or 16 plants, and we'll cover each of those. So planting here, this is spinach. So if you look at the back of it here, it says how deep to plant it, and right here it says thin, this is pretty easy, to 6 inches. Carrots here, where it says thin right here, 3 inches, and that's what you want to pay attention to. Turnips here, this one takes a little bit of looking here, so plant about 4 inches apart. And where you notice where it says rows should be spaced at 18 to 24 inches, you don't need to pay attention to the row spacing. You just want to look at how far apart each individual plant needs to be. For beans here, and I think this one here, let me see here. So bush type beans, 6 to 12 inches apart in beds, pole type 6 inches apart. Okay. So if a plant gets very large, once it's fully mature, you're only going to plant one plant into that square. So if it says thin to 12 inches, you will plant one. So for most of your herbs, you'll do one plant in the middle of that one square. Next is if it says thin to 6 inches, like your lettuce, your spinach, any leafy type things, you can pretty much do 4 per square. So it'll say thin to 6 inches. So in one square, you'll have 4 plants coming up. And when it says thin to 4 inches, you can plant 9 plants per square. So things like lettuce, some leafy lettuce, some beans, beets, spinach, those things you can do 9 plants in one square. And then finer planting is thin to 3 inches or less. And this, you can plant 16 plants per square foot. So things like carrots, radishes, green onions, right here you can do 16 plants. They don't take up much space. Things like carrots, they take up very minimal space. Green onions, very minimal space. So in 1 litter square, you can do 16 plants. So if you did 3 squares of carrots, you will have, that's 48 carrots in 3 litter squares of, in 3 litter square feet. This is a little planting guide which you should receive via email, and just a quick guide on how to plant some of your vegetables. Well, no planting exercise today. All right, so replanting. So after you harvest your vegetables, basically you dig up your vegetables. Then all you need to do is you need to add compost to that area to provide nutrients to that square again, and then you can replant with another plant. So a couple of good things about it is that you're automatically practice crop rotation, because typically, like in the springtime, you planted radishes. They take very quick to produce, and by end of May, they're done. Then you can plant something like beans or lettuce, which will be it's a different crop, and also so you have decreased chances of diseases and pests, and you practice your crop rotation and successive planting all at the same time without even really doing it. You're practicing those things. Now watering, it's very easy. There's multiple ways you can water. You can, because the plants are so accessible and easy, unless you have a lot of raised beds, square foot gardens, you can typically water them individually. I usually try to keep either a 5-gallon buckets available with warm water with a lid so it doesn't get overgrown with mosquitoes. Or you can set up a drip irrigation system. So if you have multiple square foot gardens, a drip irrigation system is a very good system to use. Or you can use a hose or sprinkler. Biggest thing is you want to keep that soil moist, and a lot of the seeds packets tell you how to water your plants. So not all plants need the same amount of water. So you can look at the seed packets or look up instructions specific for those vegetables. And as they grow, obviously they will need more water. So you can just water by hand, very simple. Or this is a drip irrigation system. You can typically buy a drip irrigation kit for about $20 at any of your garden centers or the big box office stores like Lowe's or Home Depot, Menards. So harvesting, very simple. This is the same garden that you saw earlier. So radishes, basic, pretty simple. You dig those up. Zucchini. So leafy vegetables, things like your spinach, lettuce, anything, kale, Swiss chard, anything that's leafy. How you want to harvest is use your scissors. And so in one square, for example, you can plant 9 spinach plants in one square. And what you want to do is once they get big enough, instead of harvesting the whole plant, what you can do is take your scissors and out of each plant, harvest the outer leaves, 2 to 4 outer leaves of each plant. So in one square, you have 9 spinach plants. You harvest 2 to 3 leaves out of each plant. That gives you about 18 to 27 small leaves of lettuce. And the spinach will continue to grow until it gets too warm. And same thing with the lettuce. You can harvest the outer leaves, and that vegetable will continue to produce until it's too warm or if the season isn't right for that vegetable. Now, cost, this is just a rough estimate. I think the prices now may have gone up a little. The price of lumber with everything that's been going on has gone up. But a rough estimate to build yourself a 4 foot by 4 foot square foot garden is about $120, with including the lumber, the soil mix, which includes your vermiculite, peat moss, and compost. And this up here, this should be 1 by 8 by 12, and not a 1 by 12 by 12. So it's about $120. And I tell people that initial cost is definitely more expensive than a traditional garden on the ground, but in the long run, with the amount of time and money and effort that it saves you, it's definitely well worth it. So here's some sample square foot gardens. That's some pictures you can see. This one here is a friend of mine, or it's actually a cousin of mine. They just wanted this. This has a false bottom, and so the soil depth is only about 12 inches. This is a 2 foot by 3 foot garden, and tomatoes in the back supporting along the deck railing there. Cucumbers, and cucumbers in the front. You can just let it hang off the garden onto the ground. And this is a 2 foot by 4 foot garden. So this is a new garden. This is the picture that you saw earlier. So this is what the garden looked like in this every spring. So what we did is we got this garden all situated here. So we start off with lay down cardboard on the ground, and you can mow down or cut down any big overgrown weeds or grass or whatnot, and then lay down 2 to 3 layers of cardboard. Then on top of that cardboard, you put down landscape fabric, and then you can just set your raised beds on top of that. And then after that, you put down your mulch in between, put your grids down, and you can get right to planting. And so this is the garden picture that you saw right at the very beginning. So this is what it looked like before we did the big transformation. So this was overgrown with weeds. She basically got sick of taking care of pulling out weeds, and she stopped gardening for about 2-3 years. So she got rid of all the weeds here, pulled all these out. We laid down some landscape fabric down. This was prior to, we dug up all the weeds here, put down the cardboard, landscape fabric, and then this is what it looks like now. So we have 7 square raised beds, different sizes, trellises along the back. We have a chair there, so you can sit down here. So, and this black line here is the drip irrigation set up on a hose end timer. So now it's very easy care. You set the timer so you don't even have to water anymore. You just let the timer on, set it to whenever you want to water. So at the end of season, very easy. You can just remove all your dead plants, just like your regular garden. You can put up your trellis. If you want to, you can cover with plastic if you have a raised bed that's off the ground mainly. If it's on the ground, you don't really have to do much. Just clean up the dead debris. So these are some of the things. Your big thing close to your house. You want to try and go up and not out and all sprout out. So that's where the trellises will come in. Your soil whites is going to be lightweight, nutrient rich, drains well, holds moisture well. Depth-wise, minimum is 6 inches. And some people feel a little leery on growing things in just 6 inches. But if it's on the ground with your square foot, 6 inches, you can grow, like I said, anything. And you really don't need much for fertilizer. And if you need to, you can add additional nutrient fertilizer if you want as things grow, things like your tomatoes and anything that fruits, tomatoes and peppers and whatnot. As they start setting flowers, you can add some additional fertilizer. And then and then having the raised beds above the ground on legs. And then aisle wise, 3 to 4 feet wide. And then the grids. And big thing, like I said, for a 4 foot by 4 foot garden, for let's say for carrots wise, when you buy a packet of seeds, there are probably 200-300 seeds in 1 liter packet. If you buy a packet of seeds from like Walmart, they sell that 25 or 30 cent packet of seeds. Those things still have about 200 to 300 carrot seeds, lettuce seeds, and you are only going to use maybe about a couple dozen seeds, if that many, because most people aren't going to grow 200-300 seeds or lettuce plants in a season even. So, and then some potential for like tabletop gardens for people who don't have the space. They can grow pretty much anything anywhere, even on a deck or a little patio, balcony, or whatnot. So we'll cover some vertical gardening real quick. The nice thing about vertical gardening is that if you don't have the space, things like even with your tomatoes, your cucumbers, your squash, where those things, if you let them grow on the ground, they have a tendency to sprawl all over. So by going up with it, does two things. It frees up your real estate. Number two, it's actually healthier for the plants. So now instead of being all over the ground, they're up in the air, they get nice airflow, and your fruit will look much better when they're ripe. Also, it adds another dimension to your gardening versus everything being all flat, and I think it just allows you to grow a lot more variety of things in a smaller amount of space. So this is a simple trellis system here that we have. We'll show you. You can use it, make it out of lumber. This is 1x2 cedar. So this is a simple, very costs about $20 or so to build. So you want a nice steel, strong frame, nylon netting, and then place it along the north side of your garden. And you can also place it next to a fence or a wall. And then you can place it anywhere before your vine crops, your cucumbers, tomatoes get too big. So what you need is your 1/2-inch electrical conduit. They come in 10-foot sections. They're about $3. Rebar, which is also 1/2-inch rebar, like 3 to 4 foot length of rebar. Next is this trellis or nylon netting. They sell it at any of the gardening stores. And they cost about $4 or $5 for a 5-foot by 15-foot. And these things will last for years. They're nice and nice. And you want to make sure you get the ones that have the large openings, 6 to 7-inch openings. And then you need some corner pieces. I used a 1/2-inch PVC. These are about 20 cents a piece. These electrical conduit pieces, those are about $3 or $4 a piece. So they're a little bit more expensive. And then you want to measure your width of your trellis. Typically, I try to keep it about 4 to 6 feet wide. And that rebar, 1/2-inch rebar, you want to pound that into the ground about halfway. So about 1.5 to 2 feet into the ground. And all you have to do is slip your electrical conduit over that rebar in the ground. And then, so you'll have 2 uprights and then a cross piece. And then you want to secure your nylon netting across the bar. So you want to secure using zip ties across the top and both sides. So here's the corner piece here. And this is what it will look like. So you have your nylon netting stretched across both top and the sides and then secured with zip ties. Or you can use something simple. This is just some bamboo sticks. So other things that you can use, PVC pipe, pretty much anything that you can make a trellis out of. So very quick, last thing we'll cover is just extending the season. I know Minnesota, we only have about 3 months of gardening, but many times, even now with the warmer weather, even December, we're right now in, even in this past year in December, we had some nice weather, and there are people now that are still harvesting spinach, lettuce, and whatnot in cold frames. So very simple to make. So for your garden here, oh, hang on. Oh, sorry, hang on. Technical difficulty. Okay. Oh, hang on. Let me go back here. Go back a little here. Okay, so basically for cold frames, you can make it from PVC, covered with plastic and wooden boxes with lids. You can place it at an angle, but a simple one here. So this is a 4-foot by 4-foot garden. You can get 1/2-inch PVC that's 10 foot long, and basically you place it in one corner, stretch it diagonally across to the other corner, and then do the same to the other two corners, and then just secure it in the middle. And then all you have to do is get some plastic to place over it, and that'll keep warm enough where you can grow your spinach, lettuce until probably November, early December even, where it'll keep warm enough. So this is, if you have a rectangular shaped garden, you can cut 1/2-inch PVC to whatever size garden that you have, make a plastic frame to fit over it, and cover it with plastic. So these are some references that you can look up. So All New Square Foot Gardening, I think they're up to 3rd edition. And then as far as some ideas for planting ideas, gardeners.com has some nice ideas on laying out your square foot garden. The extension, University of Minnesota Extension, if you look up gardening, there's very good information on where to, what things to plant and when to plant. This is my business website. For all the supplies for your vermiculite, you can buy it at this Carlin Horticulture Supply in St. Paul. That's about the main place I've seen. Otherwise, some of the garden stores sell it. Home Depot, Lowe's, they sell it, but it's a bit expensive. So these are some upcoming classes if you guys are interested in some seed starting classes. This is through St. Paul Public Schools Community Ed, also Prior Lake Community Ed, and then there's square foot gardening classes as well. And this is a setup at Prior Lake Farmers Market that I'll have next year as well. So if you're interested in coming out and seeing some of the garden raised beds that I have set up. And happy gardening, everyone. And any questions at this time?
I have a question, John.
Yes.
What you mentioned that if you're growing lettuce and then you want to grow another crop after that, that you might want to add some compost.
Yes.
Do you ever add? I mean, I'm thinking after a couple years of using that soil medium, that growing medium, that you might need to add more. Do you ever add?
I do not. So the soil mix, I have gardens that I've had for 10 years. And about the only thing I add more at the beginning of the season mainly is because of most of the things, about the only thing that really degrades is the compost. Nothing else really degrades. So they're typically go down about 1 to 2 inches every season. At the beginning of the season, I fill it with compost to the level of top of the garden. I mix that in, and that's it. Only time that I will add more soil mix to that garden is for me personally is when my chickens get into it and they scratch the heck out of my garden. So half the soil will be out of the garden. Then I'll add some more soil mix to it. But you really don't have to add any more soil mix to that. All you have to do is add more compost and mix it in.
Okay, good to know. Thank you.
Other questions?
That was the big one. The continued use of the garden and what happens after a year or two.
Yep, and because like I tell people, that soil mix is not cheap. So I tell people, I've had people who've purchased gardens from me and they've actually thrown the soil mix away because that's one of the most expensive part of it. And I tell people, it's like, you don't have to do anything with it. All you do every year is just add more compost to it, mix it in, and go away. So, and the nice thing is typically you can start gardening in these in the square foot garden, just like a raised bed. They are typically by mid-April, you can actually work it pretty well. If you put a tarp or something over it in the springtime or early spring, once the sun, we start getting some longer days, that will warm up that garden very quickly.
So is there anything you could use instead of the vermiculite or peat moss?
Vermiculite, no. The peat moss now, there is a big push to minimize using peat moss because it's really a non-renewable source. So they are recommending you can use coconut coir. I have not tried that. That's a renewable resource, but I have not tried that yet.
Okay.
Any
I
other
garden
questions?
with friends who have raised gardens,
Yes.
and we have problems with shrews and moles. Is there anything we can do about that?
So if you have, so what you want to do, if you have issues with anything growing underground, so when you make the raised bed, so on the bottom side of it, purchase some 1/4-inch hardware cloth, and you want to staple the 1/4-inch hardware cloth to the bottom of your raised bed, and then set that down on your ground, on top of your landscape fabric, and that'll prevent the moles and shrews and whatnot crawling from the bottom up. And you want to I would go with 1/4-inch, 1/4-inch or eighth. I would say 1/4-inch should keep everything out. You don't want to go any 1/2 inch. Sometimes some things can get into it if it's larger than 1/2 inch. But go with a 1/4-inch hardware cloth.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? Okay, well, that should be it.